well into day 2 of the conference, and if you have missed some, you have the opportunity to go back and listen to recorded speakers and workshops and hear some great things. But today I would love to introduce you to Reverend Talitha Amadea Tejo. She's Aho. Oh, look at she said think of Tahoe, and then I said Tejo, which completely ruined it. I apologize. Talitha is a Presbyterian pastor and has been in Oakland and now works at the Children's Hospital in Oakland, which is quite a gift as the chaplain there, and will be speaking with us today. She's brought her book that she'll explain a little bit more about, that you can also look at later, and she will be sharing with us and also encouraging us to join in conversation with her. She's a conversation leader, as she described herself. So let's give a warm welcome to Talitha.
Thank you so much, Beth, and hello, everybody. It is so good to see you. Some of you I know well, and some of you are new to me, and some of you are on Zoom, so I can't even see your faces, but happy to be here in fellowship with all of you and in conversation with all of you. Yes, when I was a church pastor, I spent plenty of time having conversations with people about the climate crisis and our Christian response to it. Now, as not a church pastor, now as a hospital chaplain, I don't get to have those conversations very often. They don't often come up in the hospital. But what I am doing in the hospital is really important as well. As a hospital chaplain in a pediatric trauma center, which Children's Hospital Oakland is, it's a level 1 trauma center, I'm studying the depths of human grief and the strength of human tenacity. And those are really important to me as I prepare my spiritual work about the climate crisis. It's really feels really connected because I get to see utter sorrow at the hospital and sheer grit too. And so I know that God has called me to this for this reason, that even though I'm not actively talking with people about how they feel about the climate crisis in my day-to-day job, I'm learning really important spiritual lessons and working on deepening my own emotional capacity, which is the central thing that I think we need to do in terms of our spiritual response to the climate crisis. So I'd love to introduce ourselves a little bit and say, just as a way of introduction, I would like you to offer from 0 to 5, where 0 is disconnected from the climate crisis. None of you are zeros because you're here, okay? So if 0, we're completely disconnected, and like 3 and 4 are like, yeah, this is most of my life is connecting to the climate crisis and engaging with it. And where 5 is like so connected that you're literally unable to disconnect, even for a few minutes. You know, on a scale from 1 to 5, how engaged are you feeling with the climate crisis? No right answers and no judgment that everybody should be at a level of 4, anything like that. But I'm just curious who we have in the room in terms of how much of your spiritual life and your working life the climate crisis is engaging from 0 to 5. You can show fingers, you can say it out loud, and you can put it in the chat. So, I see a 4, I see a 3, a 2, a 3, a 3.5. Is that a 3.5? Yes. Okay. A 5, 4, 4, 4, 4, 5. Yes, there's some 4s and 5s and 3s. What do we have on the chat? Is anybody putting numbers in the chat? Y'all who are on the Zooms, please put a number in for how connected and engaged you are with the climate crisis, where 0 is utterly disconnected and 5 is like too connected that you're overwhelmed. Any Zoomers?
4, 4, 4.
4, 4, 4.
3 4.
I would say 4.
3.
4.5, okay, all right, yeah. So the little space there, a little bit of space
a little
there.
space because, yeah, you have to have a little space so you don't get overwhelmed and can't do anything.
Yeah, so you've got the wisdom of trying to keep a little space between the utter overwhelm of having it be every waking moment, yeah. All right. So thank you for introducing yourselves and like coming into the room in that way. We're talking about our real lives here. So wherever you come from and wherever you are feeling, whether you're feeling too engaged or not engaged enough or just right but kind of confused, that's just right for today. Bringing our real selves in. So we're going to be talking first about the particular vulnerability of young people as they face the climate crisis. Coming of age during the climate crisis is like trying to learn how to swim during a flood. It's really hard. Young people, because of their developmental stage, are more existentially open. I think we can all relate to the research that shows that you bond the most intensely with music when you're under 25. Like the emotional bonds you make with music at that age are so intense, they can never really be replicated later in life, even if you are a professional musician. And so young people are just kind of all emotion at certain stages. They're, which means that they are more likely to get emotionally flooded. They're more likely to be a 5.5 on the scale that we just did. And emotionally vulnerable. So a trauma when you're young affects you more than a trauma when you're older. We know that, research says that. Because young people are busy forming themselves. They're putting together the building blocks that will be their sense of self, their sense of God, their sense of what it is to be a human with other people. And that's the chaos that we are experiencing in the climate crisis is a very big challenge to that stage of spiritual formation. I want you to think about when you were young and maybe you got to go to church camp and be in nature and feel like, oh, God is all around me and the universe is amazing and everything loves me and I'm just so happy to be with God and my church in nature. Has anybody had that kind of experience? Yeah, I'm seeing lots of nods and hands up. We are still trying to give that to young people today, but it is hard because they have seen these traumatic things happen to the environment around them. There was a church camp that we brought our youth to regularly year after year, which then twice we were not able to go to because it was so smoked out. And then it closed because of the march of capitalism and the insistence that everything turn a profit. The camp closed. It just was not making ends meet in this harsh economic climate we have. So think about that when you have that kind of loss. That was the place where you could go to feel God all around you, but then it was a dangerous place because you could not breathe the air. And then it was a place that we actually were not able to go to anymore. So that's a particular, grown-ups can cope with that a little bit, but when you're a child or a teenager and church camp was like the big spiritual experience you had ever had, to have your church camp now inaccessible because of these reasons, makes it much harder to have that experience, that spiritual experience with God. So the climate crisis necessarily causes a spiritual crisis. And I mean this very broadly. The spiritual crisis could be a crisis in how we make sense of self, how we make sense of God, how we make sense of relationships that we experience. But it causes a spiritual crisis. And our churches are unfortunately not always well equipped to meet people in spiritual crisis. Hospital chaplains are trained in it. It's what we do all day. We are crisis catchers, but churches might not know what to do with somebody who might show up on Sunday morning and can't stop crying. We're used to catching people in our churches with like, oh, you're new, here's a brochure, and things like that. I think back on a conversation that some of you were in that our church leader, Montclair Presbyterian Church's leadership had, where we were talking about how do we welcome people? And the ideas were like, oh, a different colored name tag. And like, what about we have special coffee cups, maybe we should give them a coffee cup to take home with them, or things like that. And one really brave man spoke up and said, I don't think that's why people are coming to church. Especially in this day and age, if you want to have a nice time with your neighbors, you might just go to a concert in the park or go to brunch. Like, people come to church in this age where church is very optional. People come to church because they need it. They come because they're in spiritual crisis, because they need to make sense of this changing world around them. And we aren't always ready to catch them there. And we're missing out on a big opportunity if we don't have the ability to really meet somebody in their spiritual crisis. I need to go over there and get a book, because I want to read an excerpt, and some of you know this well, but it's a really important one to me. I had a conversation with a college student who was, college student who was in ecological studies and was really feeling the overwhelm there. It was so difficult for her. And this is what we had a conversation in person, but then she ended up writing her response. So I'm just sharing what she wrote. To me, nature feels like the core of my identity. My life centers around nature. My career path is in conservation. My hobbies are hiking, backpacking, birding, and plant identification. My art is mostly paintings of nature. For me, it's hard to separate who I am from my love of nature. Climate grief is intertwined with my own sense of self, which can be very painful. Growing up, I used to believe in a more traditional sense of God, but lost that in my teenage years. These days, I view nature itself as the divine. So for me, it feels almost as if God is dying. That's the spiritual crisis that she was bringing to church with her, and not seeing it every week in the church service. That kind of depths of sorrow and concern and loss. My question is, why don't people talk about this more? And I offered you to say your answers if it comes to you, why people don't talk about their spiritual crisis more, or why we don't bring it up proactively in our church settings. Because it leads to conflict. It could lead to conflict, yes. It could lead to conflict, and that's risky and scary. Speak up or put it in the chat. Yeah. Why don't people talk about this more?
I think there is an overarching expectation that we should be happy Christians.
There's an overarching expectation that we should be happy Christians. Yes. Isn't that so strong and difficult to deal with?
And people don't want to make themselves that vulnerable.
People don't want to make themselves that vulnerable.
it's kind of like you wouldn't just be wading in the water. It feels like you'd be jumping into the deep end.
Yeah, it's not like you would be wading in the water. You'd be jumping into the deep end, and there's not a way to ease in slowly to conversations like this. Once you start it, it's big. Yeah.
I think people don't talk about it because it feels too big.
It feels too big.
Also, people are afraid they won't know what to say.
People are afraid they won't know what to say.
I think that a lot of folks view church as a place where you go to listen.
Church is a place you go to listen.
As opposed to really talking about what is uppermost in your heart.
As opposed to a place where you go to talk about what's uppermost in your heart. Church is a passive place where you receive. Yeah.
I'm getting because they are not asked.
Because they are not asked. Nobody ever asked them, so they can't talk about it. Yeah.
Feels, I think it's integrated in our whole person, that it feels like being political or non-spiritual to bring up
It's off topic. It's political or it's not spiritual.
I think in connection to that, there's also a fear of being misunderstood.
A fear of
being judged as well.
A fear of being misunderstood or judged.
Or we hesitate to share with a large group about something so personal.
We hesitate to share with a large group about something so personal. It's intimate, isn't it? Yes.
Because you might be judged if you do.
You might be judged if you do. So you don't know, is it safe? Is that, will these people give me a harsh or judgmental or hostile reaction, or maybe they'll just bluster and not know what to say and it'll be awkward.
Am I the only one that's feeling this?
Am I the only one that's feeling this? Oh my, when we took a group of teenagers to a climate march, one looked around and she was like, wow, it's really good to know that I'm not the only one who's so angry. Yeah.
It's kind of like talking about your own cancer. Or, it's like you need a safe place to talk about it.
It's like talking about your own cancer. You need a safe place to talk about it. May I offer the word like intimate? Yeah. So we need to deepen our emotional capacity. This is all the things that you've been talking about are ways in which we need to deepen our emotional capacity to make things safe for people, to make things open and real. We need to be comfortable with more than just the 4 basic emotions. So mad, sad, glad, and afraid. Those are like the 4 basics, right? My child can do those. He's 2. He can do mad, sad, glad, and afraid. But let's be honest, at church, we mostly do glad. Maybe a little bit of sad, but the sad is always like in the middle of the service because you have to get to glad by the end, right? Do you see that? So step 1, we could get more comfortable with the other 3. So sad, mad, and afraid. Could we get really sad at church? Like maybe read those lament psalms that are just sad at God and mad at God. Can we get sad enough to need tissues in church? Can we admit how afraid we are in church? Can we do it without rushing to clean it up and get back to glad right away? And can we have like that mad feeling that the teenager was so happy to see at the climate march? She's like, wow, other people are really angry too. What if she saw that every Sunday in her church community, that other people were really angry too and were not afraid to show it? And I want to say also, like, you could say, yeah, sure, the preacher should preach about that. And not all of us are preachers. So this is everybody's job in your prayers when you're invited to maybe pass the mic around or write something. Like, you're invited to be emotional leaders in your prayers, in your announcements, and in your coffee hour conversations and your small group work. All of these places are places where we need to expand the range of things we feel and express openly. And if the teenagers don't see it, I use teenagers as a particular example, but it's probably a lot of other people as well. If they don't see real emotions being expressed at church, if they only see the glad, it just will not resonate for them. That will not be the place where they can have their spiritual growth. They're going to find their spiritual growth on a podcast instead. And it will be a loss for all of us because we won't have that opportunity to grow together. Like, podcasts are great. You need to get your spiritual growth anywhere you can, but it's so much more powerful when we can do it in community. And so by showing these depths of emotional ranges, we can help them. All right. I would like to introduce you to a resource called the Climate Emotions Scale. It was created by Isaiah Hernandez, who is online with the handle Queer Brown Vegan. I highly recommend following them. And it's a new tool that's helpful for anyone who wants to broaden their emotional capacity, specifically related to climate work, or to encourage it in your church. We've got just a range here. Look, it's not just mad, sad, glad, and afraid. We've got eutera, soliphilia, solastalgia, eco-anxiety, ecophobia, eco-guilt, eco-grieving, tierra trauma, and eco-rage. I'll talk through them. And I want to say also, this is a new resource and new to me. So I'm going to do my best in presenting it, but I highly recommend you read Queer Brown Vegan's blogs and things for more education on these. So eutera is the feeling of being interconnected with Earth. You see EU in the front, EU, which you might have seen in Utopia or Euphoria. It's a good, pleasant, positive feeling. So it's basically what I was describing that many of us had at church camp, where you feel, one of our youth said, like nature is hugging you, where you feel like a loss of boundary in a happy way, where you feel like you can meld with the earth and understand the interconnectedness of ourselves with the rest of nature, with the environment. And that dissolving of boundaries leads to a beautiful, peaceful consciousness kind of feeling. It's intensely spiritual. And so it's totally what we're going for when we plan church retreats and camps and conferences, and why we try to prioritize keeping beautiful places available for people to go to. That's eutera. Oops, no, I'm not clicking through this. I'm just leaving this here. Okay, soliphilia is the love for place. It's the love and appreciation for a location, a bioregion that's deeply connected in a local particular interconnectedness, not a cosmic sense, but a deep knowledge of the kind of intimacy of the local region. If you have a deeply embedded relationship with your home environment, you can cultivate the earth, regenerate it, constructing healing practices that are circular, where you take care of the earth and then you experience it taking care of you. So maybe you farm or garden, or maybe you hike or take care, remove invasive species in your local watershed. When you're deeply attuned to your particular place and you know intimately the needs of the rivers and the creatures, for example, that are around you, this kind of love can grow. Our Bible is full of this because especially the Old Testament was written by people who knew their land intimately. Jesus walked the rivers and valleys and mountains. Like, he knew places on his local ecosystem in a way that we who drive by it can hardly imagine. They lived close to the land, all the people who wrote the Bible. And so for us, we're more likely to have a binary where we experience soliphilia maybe in parks and recreation spaces. But at best, we could feel it for any part of our environment, and the particular microclimate that we know best is where soliphilia grows. Solastalgia. You might see it kind of looks like nostalgia. Solastalgia is related to pain, and it's this sorrow for a particular place. It's the anxiety and sorrow you feel when your natural environment is impacted, especially the kind of environment that you know intimately and well. And when natural home environments are altered, it can affect you on a physical and psychological level. This is what the Psalm talks about when it says, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and we wept as we remembered Zion, as we hung up our harps on the willow trees, these like strange willow trees that we don't have willow trees back there, like as they mourned for the loss of their home environment, Jerusalem, which was now in ruins. So it's the deep feeling of sorrow we feel when our local forest is damaged in a fire or our neighborhood is damaged in floods. And it could also be felt in the marching along of capitalism, because neighborhoods don't need to be flooded to be evacuated. They can just be declared a bad investment, and they are, evacuated in a different way by disinvestment. So solastalgia is what we feel when we have pain for the loss of a place. Those who are more deeply connected to the land, like those who are more likely to feel soliphilia, are also more vulnerable to solastalgia. And those who are disconnected are likely to feel less of both of those. Eco-anxiety is the anxiety for Earth, anxiety about the future of the natural environment. It can worry about the disasters that are set to happen as the climate continues to worsen, rising carbon emissions, rising temperatures, melting of glaciers, and land deforestation. You know what it is, but they lead to our increased anxiety levels. And because these are all very big things about which we have very little scale of control, it's easy for the anxiety to spiral out to a level not usually seen or dealt with by psychologists who are used to, who are trained over time to deal with like personal sized issues. So eco-anxiety can be especially disabling. Ecophobia is the fear of the planet being unlivable in the future. And I want to offer some clarification here, because people of privilege, people with money, often imagine an unlivable situation in the future, which is actually a situation that poor people are living already today, or people in other places are living today. But the phobia, the fear that comes up, is an important emotional reaction because it gives us a sense of horror, and ecophobia actually causes us to withdraw and disconnect from the earth, because we have imagined scenarios that are so hard, that are bringing up shock, and we want to distance ourselves from them. Eco-guilt. Eco-guilt is the regret of knowing you can or could have done more. When you feel you could have contributed more to help the earth. It can also be called self-blame, because it can get very, very personally focused to an unhealthy extent. A healthier response would be to be focusing on external systems that were in play. Now, if you are an oil company CEO experiencing eco-guilt, I would not redirect you with that, or call it self-blame. But for most ordinary people, eco-guilt quickly gets out of proportion. Guilt is a good angle, though, to address in church because we have an ancient and well-worn relationship with sin and forgiveness and grace. So eco-guilt is a great thing to be addressed in church, but it's also good, instead of addressing it, to actually redirect it sometimes, because a lot of people experience it so far out of perspective. You may feel guilty because you bought one thing in styrofoam and plastic packaging. The oil companies love you to be like really focused on that, and to take it out of perspective and spend your whole life thinking about those things. 3 more. Eco-grieving are our tears for the earth. And eco-grieving, just like any other kind of grief we may know, is not linear. People know about the stages of grief, but guess what? The stages don't go like this. They go back and forth. You're sad today, angry another day, numb the next day. Eco-grief is what we feel for the physical disappearance or just degradation, but also death of species and ecosystems and landscapes. This type of grief is noted by researchers to be a disenfranchised grief. That means like a grief that is not publicly known or talked about. Whereas grief counselors are easily available to talk about the death of a loved one, they're not quite so easily available to talk about eco-grief. I would commend to you the Good Grief Network, but also commend to you just like on your own forming support networks of people who are willing to talk about eco-grief, because sharing it is really important. It's something that churches can do very well. Tierra trauma is the pain of the earth. The sudden grief or pain you experience when you witness a traumatic environmental change, which we are all doing. It's like an acute earth-based existential trauma that happens in the here and now. And it could be seen in land destruction, forest fires, floods, tornadoes, oil spills, heat waves, as well as evacuations and displacements, which are traumatic events. Even if everything goes well, even if you evacuate and then go back and all is well, the evacuation itself, and even sometimes the preparation for the evacuation can be traumatic. So you can experience this firsthand. We're also very easily able to experience it vicariously these days through videos and photos and news and the radio. And it results in the same things any other kind of trauma can bring us, like flashbacks or dissociation, physical symptoms, or mental health symptoms. And finally, eco-rage. I love that Queer Brown Vegan defines eco-rage as the anger toward colonial systems. This anger is addressed specifically towards the system and companies and people in power that have continued to allow the degradation of the earth. And this is a long lineage. It is not just in the oil booms that this has happened. There has been a long lineage of Western society in its colonial and settler ways, disenfranchising Black, Indigenous, and people of color, removing them from the land, dehumanizing them, and preventing them from practicing their ancient, wise, regenerative practices that do take good care of the land. So channeling this eco-rage in the right direction towards the legacy of industrialization, commodification, and the march of capitalism under the guise of progress is really important and sacred work. That is the climate emotions scale. And I would love to know from you which of these you feel. If any of them are new for you with like, that thrill of like, oh, that's the word for the thing I've been feeling and not had a word for. And which of these you recognize. And I do encourage you to, in this room, we pledged to be a safe space here. I encourage you to share emotionally as you're able as part of our project to deepen our emotional capacity together. So, and I'm also, if you feel more comfortable saying it and having me repeat it, that's fine, but this mic travels. So I would love to invite anybody who wishes to speak about which of these resonates with you to do so on the mic.
I would say that I feel,
Can I bring this to you?
well, if you have to, go ahead.
I don't have to, Susan, but if you're willing, it would be lovely.
Thank you, Talitha. I know I feel eco-guilt sometimes because I am trying to do my best, but my best, honestly, I know is not good enough. I know I could do more. I'm doing pretty good, but if I blow it on the food part, like I can stay away from the beef, you know, but I could go 100% vegan and no, I am not doing that. So that's it. So I'm working on it, right? But of course, there's all those other things that get mixed in too, but that is what popped up for me.
Yeah, thank you. And that those very personal things, like it's between you and your stomach. Like that's very, like to decide what you're eating. It's really personal and emotional and can be very easy to trigger an outsized sense of guilt really easily. And then to try to have like the appropriate level of responsibility. Ed, did you want to speak yet?
Yeah, I've experienced all of these. Tira trauma, especially. I've had family who've lived in Santa Rosa, family who's lived in Reading, family in Paradise who lost a lot of property and almost lost their lives. And seeing places where I grew up that changed permanently. You know, it's traumatic. And I think that eco rage, I'm not sure. I'm starting to feel that way. I mean, it's not like something that, yeah, I'm not sure.
I would say it takes courage to have rage. You know, it's not what's expected of us, and it can be painful also. Thank you. Thank you. Would anybody else like to share something you felt, Suzanne?
Thanks, Talitha. I find that I'm experiencing something like ecophobia, but it's fear of future eco-grief and trauma. I just sometimes feel so gripped by the fear of the pain that's to come. I mean, and also the pain that's happening right now, but just this sense of this apocalypse that's heading our way, and this terror about all these things that I love being, you know, this future that's so frightening.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, we can have phobia about the trauma and anxiety that's coming. Yes, is there a Zoomer?
Yeah, I have experienced almost everything, but mostly eco-guilt, eco-anxiety, and eco-rage.
Experienced everything, but mostly eco-anxiety, eco-guilt, eco-rage. Great.
Sure, I would say eco-grief, hands down. Something that I have to keep at bay all the time.
Thank you. And you are looking at the specifics of the losses that we're experiencing. Thank you. Another one. Can you just say it there so they can hear it?
I have been a medical responder to natural disasters for 15 years. Often people are angry at nature for their losses in the disaster.
Yes, and I would venture that they also get angry at God. Yeah. Big anger there.
I have trouble picking one of those out, but
I feel like in my education, I was cheated. And yet I'm a public school teacher, and I believe that education, public education, is vastly important. We were taught that civilized is better than primitive. Well, I'm sorry, but the primitive people we should have learned from, they lived on this earth with a very soft footprint, and we have just mucked it up.
I salute you for finding that out and putting it so succinctly, but yeah, there's a lot of anger there when you realize the myth of Western civilization, which is so commodifying and destructive.
Do you want to speak, Emily? Yes. I think recently most share trauma, especially like reading news about the Maui fires and then a couple of disasters internationally right after that. Just the pace of what's happening and the impact to so many people's lives lost and just whole communities gone. On a daily basis, if the news isn't like that, I'm more often in eco-anxiety or eco-guilt. I'm kind of fascinated that your descriptions of the earlier ones and my examples of them are mostly all like very young ages. So the only ones recently that I can think of touching into those emotions were writing poetry about that time in my life, about being 7 and wandering around.
I'm so grateful that you had those experiences when you were young, because we imprint more deeply on those experiences when we had them when we were young. We can continue to draw on them, and I also resonate with that. Like church camp, that was that was where it was for me. Anybody else? Yes, Art.
Well, I was thinking, I've experienced all of these as well, and it's interesting to me that all of this is based in something positive. This deep connection to the earth that you were talking about earlier. And I find myself driven back to the land. Like, I find myself doing more gardening. I'm getting more interested in native plants. I need to put myself in nature. And I just wonder if there's some kind of, for humanity, some sort of purification process going on, kind of reflecting what Sari was saying, needing to let go of these artificial instruments. So I don't know, those are thoughts, but like right now I'm in the rage stage. I'm terribly angry at oil companies and banks. But it reflects my love of what we all are talking about here.
Thank you for pointing out how it's rooted and grounded in love. Yes, okay.
My thoughts are confused, and Art, thank you, because I think what you said clarified what I'm feeling. I too am gardening a lot, and the wonder, been gardening for 23 years, more, 30, and to see soil transformed when you take out the weed killers and you put in the worms is life-giving, literally, and stopping mowing your lawn and working with what's there is what did I say? Soliphilia is deeply healing for me, but in the context of what's happening on the larger scale, I am just bereft. Every single day. I'll just share today's item for me was this article about how investment companies are buying up single-family homes and turning them into rentals where the prices go up. So that people don't care about the land, that they don't own the land, they don't have a connection with it, and they just feel. And it's just today's news. So the daily news of people making it worse because of capitalism is my devastation. It really is.
Thank you for sharing that.
few more minutes if anybody else wants to share how they feel and how they may be connected to something on the climate emotion scale. Yes.
It's not specifically responding to how I'm feeling, but I became aware of psychologists that are doing climate circles that are like what you had suggested churches do, but just a way for psychologists to start the conversation together and then also offer that to your clients. The point is actually not to do any kind of like group therapy, like to then suggest future action, or if you have a negative response to feel better necessarily, but just to collectively share. So I think that's the name circle. And sometimes it can be followed just by like holding silence together if everyone has shared. I was really encouraged by that. I work in mental health, and I feel like that kind of, it makes me feel like the wisdom that each person has is centralized rather than like a top-down kind of knowledge. And I think we are aching so much for that kind of hearing of one another. So I would love if churches had something organized like that too. I don't know of anything yet.
It's starting to happen.
Okay, I just wanted to acknowledge one thing you just said about the soil and the worms. And I know since World War II, the decline of our soil is just awful. I remember when I was a little girl, there were worms everywhere. And just slowly, in the name of progress, pesticides and chemicals and bad things were added to our soil in the name of progress. And to think that we're growing our food like that, unless we have to pay more money, if people have the money to buy organic. And not everybody has that luxury. And I'm just so glad that you brought that up. And we have to continue to work towards that.
According to the Bible, humanity's first vocation was gardener. Keep it up. Important. And also know that we are decolonizing our minds about what a garden is. A garden does not necessarily have to be in the Western settler colonial imagination is rows of things, right? Native people in America and they worked the land, they managed the land in a way that was so subtle that the settlers did not even recognize it as care for the land, and they thought it was, nothing. So sometimes gardening, our human vocation as as gardeners did not mean to impose order on chaos, but to study the chaos and to learn it and to see how our local ecosystems are working, to learn about the native plants and things like that. Okay, one or two more. Sarah.
Well, speaking of gardens, I'm probably the world's worst gardener. However, I did learn from my friends to take kitchen scraps out and dig it around outside of my garden, my backyard. And so I would do that faithfully instead of putting it in the trash or the green bin or anything. And after a number of months, I came and went and dug down in a place where I had gone before, and behold, there was a potato that I got to eat for dinner.
I love the amateur gardening attempts too. It's just like so wonderful and surprising and joyful and fun.
Oh, the worms came too.
The worms came too. Wonderful, wonderful. And art.
Well, I guess I would just like to add too that I guess in my own journey with this, I find I'm getting involved more in with native peoples. And I've taken a couple of classes this year and really feeling drawn to the model, the connection to the land, the caring for the land, the resistance to the impulse to own the land, the refusal to embrace some of the capitalistic. I don't know, I guess for me, maybe for other people, that's very inspiring. That's kind of where we need to go. Not in the sense of living in teepees again, but more the basic principles the native peoples live by.
Yeah, I want to paint that in a broad picture too, because, can you turn this around and I'll come back here? I'm involved in our Presbytery's Truth Commission on Race Equity. So I'm getting a lot of training in how to see the world through an anti-racist lens and to see the insidious effects of white supremacy. And so not everybody's ready to hear this, but it is white supremacy, settler, colonial white supremacy that has devastated this land, that has laid waste to our climate, that has pumped fuels into the atmosphere with no regard for the cleanup in the pursuit of the dollar. And so just keep that in your mind, that frame, as you say, oh yes, Native wisdom is really profoundly healing against this structure of white supremacy that has laid waste our land and polluted our seas. There's a Zoom, yeah?
Chat.
Yes.
I have felt it's probably too long. I have felt over the years, profit-making companies have manipulated the brain of men and women. My ability to appreciate different colors have made me choose the upholstery color more than 1,000 choices, my crockery sets, the times I have to refurbish my house, kitchen, wardrobe, whatever, etc. I search for a phone cover, shoes, dress, knife, etc. I get more than 100 choices. I always think, do we actually need these choices in the walk of everyday lives? Some of the wholesalers sell packs with more things, just changing the consumer behavior. So it's important to keep checking our thinking and behavior. It's changing our young generation so much. Sorry, too long.
Have fun questioning everything. It really is good to shake up your mind in these things and just make room for different ways of thinking. All right, I'm gonna briefly mention one more thing as we close. So all of our spiritual needs are real and important. These spiritual crises that we come to when we are overwhelmed by these emotions, these spiritual crises are not problems to be fixed. They are invitations from God to go deeper. They're invitations to process, learn, grow, and grow closer to God if you can through all of these things that come up. And so I work in a medical model, and everybody is always quick to say, oh, here is the problem. She is not coping appropriately, or whatever. What does coping appropriately even mean when your child is in the hospital? Whatever you do is going to be what you can do. And as a chaplain, I've learned to say, look at the strength instead. Where is the invitation for beautiful growth that this person is encountering in their moment of crisis? Where is the strength that they are bringing to it? So spiritual needs are not problems to be solved. They're invitations to grow and come to, on the other side, there may be great blessings of peace and serenity, but maybe not just peace and serenity. There might be blessings of energizing and desperation. I've been looking at the positive aspect of desperation. It's different than despair. Despair is when you give up, but desperation is where you're like, yeah, hell yeah, all in, I'm gonna do this, whatever it is. So that's the spiritual, the solution, not the solution, but the end we could get to. when we've done our spiritual work and when we've been supported through our spiritual crisis. I specifically want you to be aware of a spiritual bypass, though, which is when you try to hurry somebody else from their spiritual need to their spiritual growth without letting them do the messy work in the middle. The clearest example I can give of this is if at a funeral, somebody were to say, oh, but let's not be sad, she's in heaven, right? You all recognize that as a spiritual bypass, because it is true, and somebody has done the spiritual work of like yelling at God and blah, gone through it all, and then finally they have arrived at the hard-won and difficult consolation that they can be joyful because this person is in heaven, right? But there's a lot in the middle there. And so if you try to take somebody who is just entering the funeral room and say, please go to the end of this process and please be happy, like, how do you even know if that is the end of their process? So I could have a lot of deep hope about the world, but I can't just give it to somebody else, right? Everybody has to do their own spiritual work to get to the place where they can have the hope. You think about the lament psalms in the Bible, which are most of the psalms. So, you know, if you open to a random psalm, you're more likely to get to something where they're like, hey God, this is terrible. This is terrible too. I hate this. How could you? Like verses after verses of lament. And then maybe at the end, 3 verses of joy. Guess which ones are written hymns about? The last 3 verses. Like that's what we sing and share so much, but we gotta do the messy work to get there. So please don't hurry anybody else along through their spiritual needs or through their spiritual crisis. Just trust that with love and support, they will work it out between them and God in the way that they need to. Couple minutes for thoughts and questions. We already had a lot of thoughts, and I thank you for sharing your feelings. I really thank you for that beautiful, precious, and valuable work we're doing. Any thoughts or questions as we wrap up? Suzanne.
My question is about the urgency of acting to address the climate crisis, but also not hurrying people to the point of action, which is the thing I always worry that I'm doing. So I feel this urgency, we all know about the urgency, but then sometimes people aren't ready to take action, they're still trying to deal with the grief of what they see.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts about those two kind of tensions?
So the climate crisis is urgent and spiritual growth can't be rushed. How do we do those two things at the very same time? It's really hard. I don't have one answer. I wish I did, but it's something to desperately pray about, you know? Like, how can we help people move along? Generally with just kindness toward them. And I wouldn't ever say that you should like sugarcoat what you see and what you believe. And there are some who are called to be prophetic and be speaking truths that other people are not ready to hear, right? Like I just did with white supremacy. I don't know, somebody's not ready to hear it, but other people are. And we each need to see what our calling is. So there's the people who are with us, the people who are with us and really strong with us. There are the people who are like positive allies, but not very active. There's the people who are neutral, not gonna do anything. And then there's the people who are actively opposed. So you gotta know your audience. If you go to a city council and you speak on an issue that you know you're not gonna win, right? But why are you at city council? You are speaking to your neutrals who are there. You are providing the encouragement that the neutrals need to move to slightly allied, right? And the people who are in spiritual crisis are often the people who are active allies working really hard. So they need that gentleness and care to move through it. But there's other people that just need to get energized by like, whoa, look at her energy. This is important. I love it, you know? And we can think about what our audience is and how we feel called to interact, but there's not one right answer.
They want to ask a question over their mic, so I guess, go ahead.
Can they ask a question over their mic? Let's hear it.
Scientist? Sherwood here, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so here in Virginia, we've been through this death of the coral reef. We've seen this movie, Chasing Coral. I don't know whether everyone has seen it.
Death of the coral reef.
But the overwhelm, it's just, I feel overwhelmed by the coral degradation that's being caused by the rising ocean temperatures. And in the film, there's a powerful exposure of the anguish and the pain of the scientists who are working on this, who themselves are being traumatized by the coral crisis, and just feel the incredible need for healing conversations for the frontline workers and the researchers themselves. We've talked about mental health care as now being part of the agenda for people who are working on coral health. So I just, at this moment, I just feel like I want to take my shoes off and walk in the wet grass barefoot to reconnect personally, to get dirt on my hands, and then try again to decide my priorities for action.
Thank you, that is beautiful, and please do that on behalf of all of us. Take your shoes off and walk in the wet grass, and thank God for, so at the hospital, I see people who are profoundly disabled, children who have been in car accidents or gun violence, who are altered for life. And it seems an appropriate metaphor for us. Like the death of the coral reef is an important part of our world that is dying, and there are other parts that are alive. There's, and what I'm learning in my hospital work is that humans are able to do such incredible, powerful things as long as they have love and a little bit of hope. It doesn't have to be a lot of hope. Was with a boy yesterday who everybody thought would be quadriplegic, and yesterday he showed me he can wiggle his shoulders. Like, there's months of waiting for him to be able to wiggle his shoulders. But other people who have not been there are going to be like, that's shocking, horrible, terrible. How would you live like that? Or think like, how could I live like that? But let me tell you, he's going to live, And so even as we have deep grief for what is taken from us, we also have to have deep joy for what is still with us, what is still living. And every bit of life is a joy and a privilege and a gift, no matter how long it may be, no matter how abled versus disabled the life may be. Just to be alive is a miracle and a gift. And let us do the best we can with every day. Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, everybody. It's time for us to end. Enjoy your lunch. Any other instructions, Beth?
Can I say one more thing that's not profound?
Sure, go ahead and say it. Zoomers are dismissed.
Okay, it's not profound, but for people who don't or can't look at the climate work as a spiritual need, if they just look at practically and vote the people into office who will do good work for our climate change.
Sure.
Yes, those are our neutral allies, or our slightly involved allies. We need them all. We need every single person. Not everybody is going to devote their whole life to it, but we want to encourage everybody on every stage of involvement.
Thanks, you all.
Have a good lunch.
Yes, there's lunch.